Okay. Well, I make that 11 o'clock Central now.
Mm-hmm. Everyone is admitted and welcome.
Yeah, I'm just trying to look at participants. Oh yes, I've got a list here. So, all right. Well, let's maybe wait another minute. I can still see we have people joining. So another 30 seconds, and then we'll kick off today's webinar.
Sounds great.
For those of you who have joined, we'll be starting very shortly. We'll just give everybody a chance to get signed in. Okay, well, I think we'll start. We still have some people still joining, but it's now 2 minutes past the hour. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar today, hosted by the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport in North America, and sponsored by Arup. Today's webinar is the second in our Urban Futures series, and today we're looking at a new era for Main Street, the future of the urban street, and taking a look at what is one of the more interesting urban planning topics that have arisen from the pandemic. Essentially, what we've seen is some quite ambitious streetscapes and designs going into our urban streets. But the question is, where do cities go from here? My name is Andrew Young, and I'm chairman of the US chapter of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, which I'll abbreviate to CILT from now on, in North America. For those of you not aware of CILT, we're a professional body for everyone who works in supply chain, transportation planning, and passenger transport. We've over 34,000 members in over 30 countries, and our mission is to develop the art and science of transport through research, education, networking, and the sharing of ideas. As a body, we support the career development of our members, offering relevant industry-based training and awarding CILT certifications, which are recognized throughout the world. I'm pleased to introduce our 4 speakers for today's webinar. And there they are in Technicolor. Firstly, Trent Lethco is a principal with Arup's New York-based integrated planning team, and he leads business planning for Arup in the Americas region. His focus is on the New York tri-state area, but he's also actively involved in planning across the US and internationally. His strong background is in transportation planning, land use policy, and infrastructure funding, which allows him to effectively link transportation and land use policy to create sustainable, fiscal, social, and environmental outcomes for clients. Deanna Stockton is the municipal engineer for the municipality of Princeton, New Jersey, who leads the engineering and zoning department, has done that for the past 4 years. In addition to designing and constructing $6 million of infrastructure projects each year, Deanna's department also reviews land development, oversees the transit system, and provides technical assistance with parks and parking. Deanna is also Secretary-elect for the New Jersey Society of Municipal Engineers. Dan McGinnis is the New Jersey office lead for McMahon Associates, a transportation engineering, planning, and design consultancy. He has over 15 years of professional transportation engineering experience specializing in traffic analysis, roadway design, lighting, streetscape improvements, traffic calming, and the design and analysis of pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And James Conway is an associate urban planner and landscape designer with Arup, based in New York. He has over 19 years international experience working with public and private sector clients across the UK, the US, Middle East, and Asia. He specializes in city scale master planning, climate responsive design, and streetscape design. So I'd personally like to thank all of the speakers today for their presentations, and also a panel which they will be engaged in later, answering questions that we received during the webinar. Before I hand over to the speakers, just like to cover some very quick housekeeping items for today's webinar. First of all, if you get disconnected, please just click back on the same link. It should get you back into this session. I'd like to ask everybody to remain muted with your video off throughout the webinar, not the speakers, of course, but for all of those that are joining, we would like to encourage any questions that you have. If you can add those into the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, we will collate those and we'll talk those during the Q&A panel that we have in the second half of the webinar. I'd also like to inform everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be made available through SILT's website and also our YouTube channel. After this event, we will email everyone that attended with the link and the details on how to watch this again at your own leisure. So now I'll hand over to Trent to start an introduction into the urban futures concept, which has inspired this series of webinars. Over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And we're happy to partner with SILT on questions of urban mobility, logistics, and supply chain management as a part of our work, thinking about how the various planning disciplines come together to help support urban communities thrive and have more sustainable futures. And a part of these webinars are intended to look at how technology and advisory services come together and through integrated planning help us collectively think through what are the solutions for the problems that we face today, which brings us to the subject matter of our discussion about Main Street and Main Street's future. You know, as we are adapting to the changing circumstances of COVID and these times, we're learning that we all really need to come together because we are truly in this together, and the solutions that we need to develop to respond to our needs need to be collectively understood and collectively implemented, and need to really align with what's required to have thriving, vibrant urban communities, even during a time of COVID and precaution to protect public health. And what we're learning as we go through these times, can you just go back, James, for a second? Is that we have to adapt and evolve with changing circumstances as information changes and as needs change. And so this is a time of experimentation, but what we learn now can actually be applied in the future. And we can use our lessons learned today as case studies and applied learning for rethinking streets and mobility tomorrow. Go ahead. Which means, you know, we really need to understand the scales of responses and think at a systemic level about what we need in society to survive and to thrive. So what do people need to navigate the new circumstances of this moment, and how can we take what we learn now and project that into the future in terms of wayfinding and accessibility, new user experiences, and redefining what the urban realm means in terms of our experience of the street and public life. But those human experiences reverberate through the buildings and the streets that we navigate along and sit along. So how can architecture and public realm respond and create new types of outdoor experiences that might be important in this moment to let us continue to engage in civic life, but might be things we want to keep in the future. Many of the things that we've talked about in terms of urban mobility and civic life in terms of good planning practice, we might want to retain and figure out how to optimize as we look towards the future and understand how our streets and our buildings can adapt and can change to create networks that are more urbane in their focus, that enable more utilization of streets as civic spaces and social gathering, while still allowing people to move. And how can we use technology to enable optimal performance and information sharing amongst all our user groups? And then based on all of these things, what policies need to change? How can we evolve from a temporary treatment to a permanent condition that allows people to move and engage in daily life, but also allows for more civic activities and more public activities to take place along our corridors that we once really thought about more as a place of movement rather than as a place of civic life or a place of commerce. Now all of that can come together in new ways to really make urban streets more vital and more vibrant, while also still allowing for the important and essential mobility that's required for our cities to thrive. So part of this series and a part of what we're doing both with SILT and with other organizations is looking for those success stories and trying to understand what works and keep what works, and also learn what was unsuccessful or what presented challenges, and what can we learn from that, and how can we change those challenges and turn them into future success. So what can we do with our streetscapes and our corridors to address some of the challenges as we move the indoors outdoors? Our sidewalks were always sort of challenging spaces because they were limited in terms of size. Our streets were challenging because there's so many different uses that wanted to take place within them. So how can we think about flexibility to create new opportunities for walking and cycling, and greater opportunities for access either to buildings and commercial spaces indoors, or how can we bring some of those commercial and indoor uses outdoors and take advantage of the outdoors for commercial activity, dining, shopping, etc. And what from this moment might we want to attain in the future, and think about the streets as programmed spaces and connected spaces that function as mobility corridors, but also function as neighborhood gathering spots and places to meet one another and engage in our community living. And this means we need to think a lot about logistics and deliveries. People are relying on deliveries and home shipments more and more as a result of the need to maintain social distance and stay at home more often than we normally would. So deliveries are of increasing importance. But as we push the indoor activities outdoors, whether it's dining or shopping, we are now creating potential conflict. So how do we manage reallocating road space to other activities while still allowing deliveries to take place, both to service residential and commercial uses? And how can we do this in a way that is graceful and supportive of civic engagement on our streets? So as we look around the New York region and look around the country, we see that there are some things that are working well. People have responded positively and enjoy outdoor dining. Winterization and responding to different climatic conditions around the country is something that needs to be taken into consideration. But this has proven to be a lifeline for many local businesses and also a lifeline for people who are looking to stay connected to one another and still have a sense of community and a sense of belonging in the places where they live. Active mobility has become a very important solution for people who want to move around their neighborhood, their city, or their community, but do so in an outdoor manner. So staying in fresh air environments on city streets and using their feet and their pedals to move around town, and closing some streets that were once dedicated to vehicle use so that they can be used for playing, for exercise, and for gathering has proven a popular and successful strategy. But in terms of some of the lessons learned, it's important that we have stakeholders who are committed to the operation and the maintenance of these temporary facilities, and that we can have a strategic plan that understands who is responsible for what, how do we respond to issues if they emerge due to broken barriers or missing elements that were once placed in the streetscape, and what do we need to do to think about short-term solutions that might need to evolve into more permanent contexts if we want to convert a street from a place of mobility to one of dining, one of social gathering, one of civic space. As we look at short-term solutions, what works in one season may not work in another. So how do we have a multi-season open streets or urban life plan that allows solutions that may have worked in the winter to continue to work in the spring and the summer, and conversely, what works in the summer, how does it evolve or change in the fall? How can we ensure that commercial uses and restaurant activities work well with people who are walking along the sidewalk or people who are riding in the street? How do we ensure there aren't conflicts between in-street dining and logistics and deliveries, which is something that we're talking about today? And how can we have some consistency in the design so that things will work well and we don't create unintended problems with drainage in gutters or garbage pickup and garbage collection, or conditions that change between daytime and nighttime? And how do we ensure durability over time? So what we're seeing is streets have taken on a completely different character. Streets now have restaurants and shopping experiences all along them. More people occupy street space throughout the day and throughout the evening. And people have really responded in a very proactive and enthusiastic way to this new outdoor city concept that has proliferated all across the country. But in that enthusiastic response to outdoor living, we see in this photo here how much every square inch is valued. You know, we have a sidewalk that was once largely for walking, perhaps for sitting and for strolling, and curb pickup and drop off for both taxis and deliveries, that's now fully occupied by restaurant activities and landscaping. On the other side of those restaurants, we see parcels and packages being delivered to residential buildings across the street, and smaller trucks and vehicles delivering items to merchants and businesses along the corridor. So all of this can work together with planning and can work together with policy, but we need to have intention around it so that we can ensure everything comes together well. And we can't forget that we need to have fun and we need to embrace the moment and give people lively, engaging, and inviting environments to come enjoy and to participate in as they try to adapt to this new experience of urban life. So different neighborhoods around New York are responding in different ways, and different neighborhoods around the country are responding in different ways. So first, James is going to talk a little bit about how one district in New York City has responded, and then we'll hear a little bit about how Princeton has also embraced the moment and come up with some new ways to rethink streets and their uses in civic life.
Thanks, Trent. So I'm basically going to talk through some of the methodologies that we've been deploying on our projects, particularly in New York. And these basically respond to requests from our clients who want to understand what the next step and then the future is of the Open Streets program, and how they can maintain the momentum that's been built over the summer and hopefully through the winter, so that these streets can continue to support the neighborhoods and the communities that they're operating in. I'm going to use the example of the Meatpacking district, but I'm going to use various different tools and others that we've used as well. So the Meatpacking district is located on the west side of Manhattan, in the Chelsea district. The little map on the right just shows the extent of the business improvement district that we're employed to look at, and the darker grey in the centre just identifies where the historic designation of this area is. Let me just advance one. Just so you know, a business improvement district, which they do happen around the world, but particularly in New York, is basically a group of stakeholders who oversee and fund and maintain and improve and promote their local commercial district. Typically, they'll be in charge of kind of street cleaning, public safety, marketing, events and overlay, beautification and advocacy in the area. And within New York, there's around 76 bids scattered across the city. The Meatpacking district itself was historically actually a residential area, but in the early 1840s started progressively becoming a market, and at the advent of refrigeration became a meat market. And at its height was, it had over 250 slaughterhouses operating at the time, and was one of the third biggest producers of dressed meat in the country for export around. The modern day equivalent of the meatpacking district is very different. It's a very funky, lively neighborhood, bustling with shops, bustling with offices and restaurants and bars, but still maintains its historic character. And there's some very key destinations, which I'm sure many of you heard of, Chelsea Market being one of the major draws to the area. The High Line, which transects down north-south through the site and brings hundreds of thousands of visitors into the meatpacking district every single year. But also there's some key externalities to the district itself. This is immediately to the west. On the left-hand side is Little Island, which has recently been completed, which is a new park based on top of a pier. And to the right-hand side of that, and you can actually see it in the middle of the photo, is the Hudson River Parkway, which is a major artery for walking and biking and cycling through the city, but also connecting a series of parks and delivering people right into the heart of the meatpacking district. So the ask for our project was the Meatpacking District bid wanted to understand what the next steps were in terms of maintaining the Open Streets program. They'd had quite a lot of success. The actual district itself is well oriented in terms of providing space for cafes and restaurants, but they wanted to understand that as this is going to be a long-term thing, how can they leverage that in the future? And these spaces, as Trent alluded to earlier, are providing some really key functions to the city. And I think people actually are very bonded with the idea of using their streets in different ways. And we're kind of looking at this opportunity of how we kind of readdress the balance and take vehicles off of our streets and parking and actually start occupying them for other functions. So just to kind of talk through the way that we approach this project is, on the right-hand side there, you can see the land uses and key activities happening within the district. And one of our first approaches is just to understand where the opportunities are, where in here needs to be maintained as vehicular access, what shop fronts actually have the opportunity to inhabit the space in front of the building. And as we start kind of unpicking the district, we can start seeing where there are these constraints and opportunities and kind of mapping these things. And as we start to map these and overlay other layers, we can start to understand where opportunities arise and where we can link activities together to kind of better enhance what's happening on particular streets. A key thing also, particularly in New York, and as we are working within Streetscape, is understanding exactly how these spaces are being used from a pedestrian, vehicular, and goods movement standpoint. And there's a lot of data-rich sources that we can use to understand, where are the pressure points, where are the places where people are actually gathering, and where should we identify spaces that would be best suited for pedestrian occupation, or on the transverse of that, actually kind of integrating better goods movement. And we can also use big data sources to kind of give us either real-time live data or kind of historical trend data to say, how are these spaces being used and which are the key routes, particularly for pedestrian movement, so that when we actually deploy a solution, it's placed in exactly the right place and we can identify connections to wider networks. And once we start developing all of these layers and sitting them down on top of each other and working with local stakeholders, working with the client and specialists in a range of different fields from logistics, transportation, and public realm design, we can start stitching these ideas together to see which ones have the greatest traction and the ones that deliver the most value, but also thinking about how that's delivered over time. And once we start having that information, and this is part of a series of other guidelines that we've been developing, kind of general design guidelines for open streets, we can start deploying new typologies tailor-made specifically for the function of those streets. So for example, in this one, this is a kind of typical open street setup where we have we maintain parking, we still maintain bike and vehicular access, but then traffic volumes and traffic speeds are reduced, so to make this a calmer environment and safer for pedestrians. Again, a kind of a build up of the slow street as one of the streets where, it probably from a kind of logistical and operational standpoint, it's not possible to shut down for the entire day, but having the opportunity to close it down when it's not necessarily needed for goods delivery and other traffic movements, that space can then be occupied by people. There's a whole range of different ways that we can kind of dial this up or down depending on exactly the function of the street based on the analysis and reviews that we've undertaken. So from all of these, we can start developing a kind of guidance document because generally a lot of these districts can't deploy these things immediately. They have to be phased in over time. And also, we're also looking at the opportunity as, what of this can actually become permanent in the future and actually become capital projects informed by what has been tested in the kind of temporary and experimental stages. And we also need to understand exactly who's going to be using it and the range of mobility users so that we're being inclusive and basically taking account of all the user groups that are in that district and area, which is different in every part of the city and around the world. And then we started developing kind of like typologies underneath these main ones where, we're building up and down, pedestrian priority and making sure that we're catering exactly for the needs of those groups. In this case, it's, basically we want to prioritize for this pedestrians, but in other cases, it might be that this is a key commuter route and we need to understand how to integrate facilities to accommodate bikes and scooters. And also, this is a very key one in New York, particularly because of our street constraints, is how do you integrate, goods movement and logistics delivery so that there is space for it to continue to happen and there aren't conflicts on the sidewalk, but also there's space so that, deliveries can continue whenever they're allowed to come in. And at the end of the day, what this has really allowed us to do is provide opportunities to experiment. This is part of the actual meatpacking district, and it was a small scheme developed at the end of the summer where they closed a section and just put out some seating and rolled out some turf. And people just started occupying it, and they took feedback. They spoke to the shop owners to understand the impact that it had on, the business. And, as these things are tested in the future, we can start to think about how we deploy more permanent solutions. I'm now going to hand over to Deanna. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm just going to talk to you about a project in Princeton.
Thank you, James. Let me share my screen. Okay, thank you to SILTS for the opportunity to join our peers at Arup to share Princeton's experience. I'm Deanna Stockton, and I'm joined by Dan McGinnis from McMahon Associates and Michael LaPlace, Princeton's planning director. Today, we will be providing a case study on Witherspoon Street. Princeton is located along the Northeast Corridor between Washington, D.C. and New York City, and it's about 45 miles from both New York City and Philadelphia. Established in 1638, Princeton is a very historic town with 20 historic districts. We have approximately 30,000 residents in 18 square miles, making Princeton the 12th densest municipality in New Jersey, but it's only a third as dense as New York City in the Meatpacking district that James was showing. As you can see in the lower graphic on this slide, Princeton's population is densest in the center, which surrounds Princeton's central business district. Below the central business district is the Princeton University campus, which is shown in the wider shading. Witherspoon Street runs from the municipal government complex at the top of the oval to Princeton's central business district and Princeton University at the bottom of the slide. The extents of the central business district span the area above State Highway 27. Princeton University is the largest employer in town, and we have easy access to the Northeast Corridor train system with a train station located on the campus. Almost half of the households in Princeton only have 1 or 0 cars, which is higher than the state average. Princeton is also an almost built out community, which means that there's very little developable land, but it is still experiencing growth. In fact, towns like Princeton with compact walkable development are experiencing 2/3 of New Jersey's population growth since 2007. Witherspoon Street is classified in motor vehicle terms as a major collector, but functions as a neighborhood main street with housing, shops, restaurants, services a public library, a public plaza, Princeton University at one end, and the municipal government complex at the other end, which also includes a community pool and park. This image is directed south towards the university and Highway 27. Before the pandemic, the municipality began a community engagement process to help form the new vision for this vital corridor. It was apparent to staff after the initial public feedback that the motor vehicle space needed to be reduced to truly make this a shared space. The leading proposal includes the removal of one lane of vehicle space to widen the sidewalks. With just over 2 weeks of advance notice of business reopening during the pandemic, Princeton successfully made legislation changes and purchased and installed the basic framework for outdoor dining and reopened retail business. Using our longstanding relationships with the merchant community and the State Highway Department, Princeton gained approvals to make Witherspoon Street one-way and repurpose the parking lanes. Approximately 80 concrete bin blocks are used to create outdoor dining spaces on Witherspoon Street where the on-street parking was. The road pavement was restriped to create one travel lane and one curbside pickup lane as shown on the slide. The Arts Council of Princeton painted the bin blocks and worked with the businesses to design and install the screens shown. Since operations began in June, we responded to business concerns by adjusting the curbside pickup regulations to allow for 10-minute parking. We've adjusted some of the dining spaces as well. And we have also issued parking tickets for people that use the curbside pickup area for longer-term parking. As winter approaches, we are now wrestling with whether businesses will try to remain open for outdoor dining and how we can accommodate snow removal. Any snow removal operations within this space will impact those bin blocks and will require additional work by all parties. Tents and their ability to withstand snow and safely accommodate heaters are also a design feature that needs to be addressed. This slide shows the roadway cross sections before COVID with the 2 travel lanes and the 2 parking lanes on top. And the bottom cross section represents the COVID layout, which allocates about 65% of the public space to pedestrians and diners. Prior to COVID, only 30% of the public space was designed for pedestrians. As mentioned previously, the Arts Council of Princeton was able to adapt its existing contract with the town to create COVID-related signage and painting of the bin blocks rather than programming in-person art classes. The local Merchants Association also assisted with creating attractive maps and press packages for use by businesses and local government. The public has been overwhelmingly positive regarding these changes, and there is a desire to make them permanent. So what's next for Witherspoon Street after this COVID experience? With the assistance of Dan McGinnis and his firm, we are completing a traffic study to analyze various alternatives in order to submit an application to the State Department of Transportation. As I noted, State Highway is at the southern end of this road, so any changes that we make to the roadway have to be approved by the State Department of Transportation. Dan and his firm, or Dan will be reviewing the traffic study process in the next few slides. We've listened to business concerns and are working to balance the pedestrian and vehicular spaces as shown on this cross section. A majority of the pre-pandemic parking will remain, but the sidewalks will be widened to accommodate pedestrians and outdoor dining better. The parking will also be flexible to allow loading activities early in the day and parking or curbside pickup in the evenings and weekends. With that, I'm turning it over to Dan McGinnis with McMahon Associates to review our traffic study considerations.
Thanks, Deanna. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. As Deanna mentioned, McMahon was retained by the municipality to examine all the potential traffic flow alternatives, just in the interest of letting the municipality assess all its options. So that includes the two-way configuration that existed before the pandemic, the current one-way northbound configuration, a one-way southbound configuration, and then of course closing that segment of Witherspoon Street to motorists altogether. Next slide, please. So of course, we needed to conduct a traffic analysis to see what those impacts are. Someone in the chat actually asked, have traffic volumes returned to normal? I think the answer is no, not in Princeton and not regionally anyway. They've recovered somewhat since March, but they're still below the pre-pandemic levels. And just to produce a conservative study, we're assuming that they will return to those pre-pandemic volumes. So of course, traffic analyses are a little more challenging during the pandemic. We had data from before the pandemic, traffic count data we collected during the pandemic, which of course reflected both lower volumes and the current configuration. So using those sources and big data, a source that James had mentioned, we were able to balance them and adjust them to produce a pretty reasonable estimate of what traffic volumes were like before the pandemic, and also use those the changes to determine how traffic has diverted, what other routes motorists are using for the southbound traffic that would normally have used Witherspoon Street, where those vehicles have gone. And we were able to produce an origin destination study to figure out what that would look like in the other direction as well. So we were able to reassign the traffic for each of those alternatives and determine what the impacts are. And that's basically where we're at now. It's still a work in progress. We've determined what those impacts are, and we're now assessing measures to mitigate those impacts, and are still working with the municipality and the stakeholders to help them decide what the ultimate configuration will be. As you can imagine, when southbound, in the northbound scenario, when southbound traffic gets diverted, it affects the state highway to the south more, and then when you reverse it, it affects the intersections to the north more. So different configurations have different effects on the surrounding street network. Next slide, please. So what lessons have we learned both from a traffic perspective and more broadly? I guess from a traffic perspective, of course, we learned that you can still do these analyses during the pandemic. It's just more challenging. But more broadly, the lessons that we've learned during this process are that, of course, the municipality recognized that businesses were suffering as a result of the pandemic, and action needed to be taken immediately. And it was taken with the implementation of this temporary one-way scheme. And we've also learned that Witherspoon Street, there's a lot of different land uses and a lot of different road users, and they have different needs. And sometimes those needs are in conflict. Some restaurants, of course, need outdoor seating. Other businesses are very interested in maintaining convenient parking. So one of the main functions of one of the values of this temporary condition is that it's really created a sort of natural experiment, which James had mentioned in his presentation. And while some people some members of the public, some stakeholders were concerned that we would draw the wrong lessons, for instance, that things seem to work under current traffic conditions, but perhaps they won't in the future. And in fact, those were borne out. We've learned that there is no substitute for actually doing the analysis to see what will happen. There may be problems that are masked by the lower traffic volumes that you need to analyze and figure out what it will look like later. But more importantly, this temporary condition has provided a way for the public to better envision the possibilities of the street and different ways of using the street. And for instance, it's allowed businesses to try to figure out, experiment, and see what deliveries are like under the current conditions. So there is a lot of value as a trial in doing this in this temporary experiment. But of course, the results are limited, and you do need to consider what will happen in the ultimate permanent condition. I'll turn it back to you, Deanna, to take an even broader look at other trends in the pandemic. The pandemic is teaching us.
Thank you, Dan. So just wrapping up and adding on to Dan's thoughts about the lessons we've learned and reflecting on all of you that are participating today, what should design professionals be considering as we move into the post-pandemic period? A big unknown is whether the flight to the suburbs will be an extended disruption. Towns like Princeton have seen bidding wars during the pandemic for housing. Will these new residents stay and bring new ideas? It's been very clear that bicycle and pedestrian spaces are important for transportation, mental health, and physical health. Will more relocation of public rights of way be made permanent to give space for non-vehicular use? From a vehicular traffic perspective, how is remote working accommodated in textbook traffic analysis? Peak hours may be redefined. Midday travel demands may be different as well. All those people that used to go into the city to work are working at home and maybe making lunchtime orders from their local restaurants. How are increased online delivery and food delivery services being accommodated in downtowns? Perhaps shorter term parking time limits will be more prevalent to accommodate these activities. Perhaps businesses and restaurant space may be changed, may be downsized if delivery service use remains high. While so many of these questions must remain unanswered for now, this pandemic has clearly shown that economic justice and health in all policies must be incorporated in planning. Affordable wireless connectivity is an essential service, and community solutions must be found to the service deserts that exist. And finally, businesses and government have to be adaptable and responsive in order to be resilient in the unknown new normal. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and we are going to stop sharing our presentation, but we are available to answer any questions that have come up in the panelist discussion. Thank you.
James, Deanna, Daniel, thank you for those presentations and for sharing some information and lessons learned from your work. We have a lot of questions in the chat room, so thank you all for posting so many thoughtful questions for our presenters. And I'd like to ask you all a question about the role of logistics and deliveries in the work that you're doing. How are they considered? What impact did logistics and deliveries have? And what role, if any, did businesses play in the plan development and the management of street activities in the neighborhoods or the corridors where you've worked?
I'm happy to kick off if you like. So particularly on the Meatpacking District project, it's a mixed use area. There's some major employers there with large populations in each building. There's film studios, there's actually a continuation of some of the Meatpacking District functions. So logistics is like fundamental still for the operation of that area. But what we were very concerned about was the kind of the overlap of logistics movements and movements of people during the day. So our kind of primary aim was to kind of separate that as much as possible. And in this case, the actual plan comes up with a way of, first of all, like timing. So understanding when logistics need to come into the area and assuring that those times are separate to when people are most active, so early mornings or late evenings. The other one was actually kind of centralizing logistics, small scale logistics operations, so that they could be consolidated and in one area of the site, off to one side, and then instead of multiple vehicles coming into the district, they could be consolidated in one area and then distributed with smaller scale vehicles and less vehicles. The other one was in some locations taking logistics access out altogether, so that when, for example, UPS deliver, they actually have to hand cart things just a short distance. But we felt that while some of those strategies kind of reduce logistics access in places, it actually helps us to enhance safety and the quality of those spaces that we're creating.
I'll jump in as well. Logistics is definitely a prime component of our design process of how to accommodate it. Economic vitality is a huge topic for our local businesses, especially because of the pandemic. So that's where we looked at the establishment of the curbside pickup in our pilot experiment to facilitate the deliveries, but also for the individual pickups by your food drivers as well as your residents. And going forward, Dan had mentioned we're looking at different options, one of which was a full closure. And that definitely raises alarm bells for some of our businesses, because it would close that direct connection from the state highway for access. As I mentioned, we are a historic town. We have very narrow roads with very tight intersections. And any of these changes that we make, if it does disrupt the delivery system as it exists now, we have to look at the impacts on all of those intersections to make sure that safety is maintained. So yeah, we can't understate the value of considering the logistics in this.
I think just to close it out, time of day delivery management has become an important strategy in neighborhoods across the country that have gone to an open streets plan, as well as designating, as Deanna suggested, pickup and drop off zones. In some ways, deliveries have been enhanced in that there's more care and more attention paid to the servicing of the trucks that we used to say, block the lane, find a loading dock. And so I think in many ways, open streets and curated streets are creating new opportunities for shippers and receivers to collaborate with local business communities and local town councils so that they actually can have a better experience servicing the increasing demands for deliveries. So there's a new attentiveness, I would say, to logistics that wasn't there before. Not because it wasn't important, but I think it was neglected. And COVID has really shown a spotlight on how important deliveries are for all of us ordering at home, but also for our merchants and our businesses and our districts to continue to thrive and survive during this time. Sticking on logistics, and Deanna, I don't know if this will be true for Princeton, and Daniel and James, maybe you have experiences elsewhere. But do cities or neighborhoods that have alleys do a better job of managing traffic, deliveries, and balancing deliveries with sidewalk and street uses in comparison to cities that don't have alleys available to them? What are your views?
Well, I'll just add to what Deanne had said about the importance of accommodating deliveries in the Witherspoon Street project. Even if the traffic analysis indicated that things would work, from a traffic perspective, obviously accommodating deliveries is a challenge with certain changes on the streetscape, and so some of the side streets along Witherspoon could really be considered alleys, and accommodating delivery space on those would be rather difficult. So at least in this case, alleys are naturally narrow, and while they are sort of out of the way of traffic flow and may make good places for deliveries in certain locations, that wasn't necessarily the case in Witherspoon Street.
So Trent, to your question, I'd say a big fat yes, and visit New York and then visit Chicago. Chicago, Chicago, which has alleys, is noticeably a cleaner city, and logistics movements are concealed within the alleys. And I think to that point I meant earlier, like separating those two flows it's really noticeable. Whereas New York, where I'm sitting at the moment, looking at lower Manhattan, there's trash piled up on the sides of the streets. There's deliveries happening left, right, and center on bike lanes, on parked in bus lanes. It's like almost uncontrolled. So I'd say very much yes. Cities with the ability to kind of integrate logistics in a more kind of coherent way and a planned and strategic way are doing a better job.
For places considering open streets, alleys might present an untapped resource for doing a lot of this delivery management, as well as one of the issues of friction points, as you've indicated, James, with open streets is trash pickup and dining don't really go well together. So if you can do garbage pickup somewhere else, and if large trucks can deliver somewhere else, it makes for a more hospitable and friendly street environment. There are lots of questions about traffic and congestion and where did it go or how was it managed. There are questions about support with town council and planning departments with these types of changes. And there are questions about adaptation and cross-contamination. So we have more questions than we can get to. But I guess what I might suggest we close on is the question of support and support for the programs and what it takes to evolve these programs from temporary to permanent. So I guess I'll combine a few questions, but what was the business input in terms of what's happened relative to open streets, and what type of support did you receive or do you think you need from planning commissions and town councils, both for the temporary program and the evolution of the program from temporary to permanent?
Give it a shot. I can't stand silence.
I was going to say, I'll jump in, James, if you want.
Okay. No, Deanna, after you, please.
On the local level.
Please, it'd be good to hear from you.
Let's see.
Deanna, why don't you start?
So let's see. As Dan mentioned, there are definitely conflicting opinions from businesses as to the best approach to open streets in our, we are a suburban town with a kind of an urban core. So we have growing pains as to what exactly are we. And so some of the response goes to that issue, but you have some folks like the full service restaurants would love to see roads closed completely. But then you have the other businesses that are the takeaway restaurants or the retail that still need to have that foot traffic and that vehicular traffic. So those are components from the business district that we are seeing as an issue. And just by taking away 50% of the direction of travel for a coffee shop, that can make a difference as well. So we have champions on the municipal council that are supporting this. But in some respects, it appears that you're pitting your residents against the business owners. And that's what we're grappling with right now. The other piece of it, like I mentioned, because we have the state highway at one end of the street, that is going to be a big concern as well, because as much as the rest of us design professionals want to get away from those vehicular concerns about congestion and level of service, the state highway department still looks to that. And so by making any of these changes on our local road, it's going to impact the function of the state highway, even though it is one of our main streets. So we always have that push and pull with the state highway. When we tried the slow streets option on residential streets, the state highway department informed us that we were taking illegal actions by putting people on sidewalks or on the roadway when we had sidewalks to give the physical distance that was needed. So that's still a push and pull in New Jersey. I think with our planning department, we've got great support, and there isn't an acknowledgement that anything we can do to make a town more resilient as well as green, then they are supportive of it. So I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Deanna. And apologies to James, but we're running close to time, and Andrew has a few closing words, so we'll let that be the final response to questions. There are a couple other questions that I think we can probably prepare a follow-up response quickly that can go out with the notification of the recording being available. Thanks to all of our presenters. I think one of the exciting things from an urban mobility and planning point of view of this moment is a lot of these are tests and experiments, so we can always adapt and pull back and change. And we can use this time and think of our streets as laboratories for innovation and optimize for the moment and find ways to design for the future that gives us a different context for our streets so they can still meet the functional needs, but also meet the expansive needs that we're asking of them as we think about a different future with more active and vibrant activities taking place along them. So with that, Andrew, I wanted to turn it back over to you for some final closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much for that, Trent, and thank you very much for all of the presenters. This has been a fascinating session. I'd also like to just wrap up by thanking Arup for your continued support and sponsorship of this Urban Futures series. And finally, thank you to everyone that joined this webinar. I hope you found it as interesting as I certainly did. The remaining questions we have, we'll try and kind of get answers to those and share those after the event. I just really like to close by saying that your feedback would be very helpful for us. So if you've attended this, you'll be receiving a short questionnaire, and we really would welcome your comments. It helps us plan future events, making sure they're relevant. So any ideas are welcome for that. And finally, I'd just like to remind everyone that, you know, this series of Urban Futures webinars is going to carry on. We'll be doing a new one in the new year, and we'll be advising everybody that's attended here what that is. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining and wish you all a very, very good day. Thank you. And Wafa, if you could maybe switch off the record, and if I can ask the presenters to just stay on. Okay, so there was a couple of questions that we didn't get a chance to answer during the webinar, but we're going to pick those up now. So I think one which is a concern that a number of people have is, you know, we have changed the traffic pattern. That probably means that we've created new congestion in other areas. We're asked about, you know, whether that's with cars or transit or even delivery vehicles. How is that kind of being addressed? Is it just seen as a problem that needs reversing, or are there some innovative suggestions of dealing with that?
Well, Andrew, I think the first thing that we've seen is that traffic has returned to pre-pandemic levels. Yet we know in most central business districts, only about 10 to 20% of the workers have returned. So what we know are lots of people are engaging in more travel to do things like getting to school, taking the kids to various activities or running daily errands. And so the traffic levels are a result of unwillingness to either ride public transit or uncertainty about how to move around the city right now. And so people are using their cars more and more people own cars. So we have seen traffic grow. That being said, post-pandemic, once people have returned to sort of a state of normalcy, we would probably see a lot of that activity return to older patterns, as well as some older trips foregone because people will work from home now more than they used to in the past. So there'll be some sifting and sorting that takes place. Because we don't have a lot of commuting to work happening right now, there is capacity in the system to absorb some of the general transportation activity. And so that's what's happened. So we don't see crushing congestion levels, but we do see sort of a return to pre-pandemic levels of traffic activity. As it relates to open streets, I'll let Dan and James speak a little bit to the impact of the local open streets programs and their influence on local travel patterns.
I'll just add to that. I agree with all that. And another change, in addition to the change in patterns Trent mentioned, is the change in mix. There's a lot more freight movement, especially on the larger highways and arterials. Of course, with deliveries increasing, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, as Trent implied, it's really an open question what the ultimate traffic is going to look like. Will it resemble pre-pandemic conditions, or some folks will continue to work from home? It's really very much an open question.
I'd also say as well, when a lot of the open streets were made in New York, the distribution of them didn't seem to have a logic. They were just placed generally where people thought, yeah, you could probably put it there. And I think now people are realizing you need a plan, and the plan involves a traffic study, involves a logistics study, involves pedestrian movement analysis, so that you can actually start making informed decisions. And I'm sure in places, yes, there are going to be potential kind of bottlenecks or displacement of activities, but you can put plans together for those as well. You can rethink how your logistics movements access an area. You can think about small scale consolidation centers, particularly in like high density places like New York. And yeah, you can adapt. But I think at the end of the day, when people go, well, it's taking me longer to drive through there now, or actually I live there and I love this, there's compromises to be made. And this is still an evolving question. We're still living through this now. Next summer, we're all going to be going, no, you do it like this. This is how you should build it. And everyone will be nodding, hopefully.
Yes, it's a very good point, James. I mean, we asked the question, where do cities go from here? And I think the conclusion is we don't know yet. We have learned a lot. We're kind of really processing what that means. I think the point you made about, changes were made because it was a crisis. It needed to be done urgently. There wasn't a great deal of planning. I think we'll finish with just one other question that we had, which links to that. And Kelsey just asked about, the street design options that were put in place were really focused on the summer that we had in North America. We're now moving out of summer, and what does that mean? What is realistically going to happen? Are we kind of still stuck in the emergency crisis, or is there a degree of planning maybe behind some of the options that are going in? So maybe we can just finish off with some thoughts on that from Princeton, and then your experience elsewhere, Dan or James.
Sorry, I'm thinking through my response. The winter months definitely, and the holiday season definitely provides a different lens to view these changes that were made. And so that, again, back to the conflict with businesses, that's where we're being pressured to remove some of these outdoor dining spaces. One, by the highway department because of safety and snow removal issues, but then also from the business community because they'd like to have the parking available for holiday shoppers. And that's where, with our future planning, we are really trying to balance the opportunities where we give as much road space to parking and deliveries, but balance it. It's all about balancing it with the pedestrian experience. None of us know what's happening with autonomous vehicles. At some point, maybe in the next 10 years, people won't be owning their own cars, or their cars will be driving for them. So that's really where we are, is going back to the slides that James showed, having this flexible space that it's parking, it's loading, it can be outdoor dining space, but then making the sidewalks large enough that you can extend awnings from the buildings to better accommodate outdoor dining with heating and protection from vehicular traffic and the noise and the smell of it. So that's what we're learning as we reflect on this transition from the summer to winter.
I would just build on that, based on my experience walking around New York and observing how these things have evolved since summer. You walk past a dive bar and they've literally put up an umbrella and a few crates either side. Other places that are a bit more higher level dining, have invested quite a lot of money in these things. And some businesses can't afford to upgrade these facilities continually. There is guidance available and there is funding and grants available from the city, which is a big help. But I think everybody's just waiting to see what happens over the winter. New York, darkest winter is a freezing, bleak place, particularly if it snows. And when they plow the streets and push all the slush to one side, that's all going to build up on these things. It's going to block the drain. There's all these kind of hurdles to go through. But they're still going to be a feature on the streets throughout the winter, providing that people are going to continue to want to eat outside. Because I don't think people are going to venture back inside anytime soon, and providing you can find a way to kind of heat these things efficiently, that's just another cost to add to a business that is on its back anyway. So yeah, not to put a negative thing on it, there's been some really innovative approaches to doing this, and in particular where on New York, where you have avenues and streets, on the streets where you have typically less traffic and more activity in terms of restaurants, and restaurants have been able to group together, so there's like a critical mass of these things in one place that actually it just feels like a little festival. Whereas you see a kind of lonely individual pop-up restaurant on an avenue dealing with traffic driving past quite fast, noise, parking either side of it. It's weird. Like I say, it's evolving, and again, I think we have to wait until next year to really understand, is this a viable option? And actually, how much is it going to cost? What's the cost return at the end, return on investment? Because if it doesn't make any sense, what's the point in spending money on it?
Absolutely. And, in 24 months' time, this could all be a distant memory. So what we want to be retaining is the things that improved life, it improved the street, and hopefully improve businesses. It kind of gives us the opportunity to enhance how we operate. So, yeah, I think the evolution is just part of that learning. Luckily, we have people like you, James and Dan, kind of who are recording this and enabling us to use it to better plan our urban spaces. So, well, thank you very much. So we'll kind of end our bonus slot here, which we'll also post with the main recording, which you will also be able to find on the same web YouTube channel. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.